Ronald Sullivan, Robert Proctor, Linda Caney Barden, and Michelle Medina. The Commonwealth is present, represented by Assistant District Attorneys Patrick Hagan, Mark Lee, and Teresa Anderson. Good morning, Your Honor. All members of our jury are present.
Good morning, counsel. Good morning. Or no, it's good afternoon, folks. I'm delighted to see that all our jurors are present and able to participate. And let me inquire, since you all left yesterday, whether any juror has discussed this case, read, heard, or seen anything about this case, or had any contact with the case outside of court. If you have, would you raise your hand? And seeing no hands raised, I find the juror remains indifferent. And we continue with the evidence today. We concluded a witness at the end of yesterday, turning now to a further witness. Commonwealth?
Commonwealth calls Michael Haag.
Sir. You go straight to the officer. Please. Stand right here. Raise your right hand, please.
You solemnly swear the testimony you shall give this court and jury and issue out pending between the Commonwealth and the defendant at the bar, the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God? I do. Thank you, sir. Kindly call me up.
Watch your step. Thank you. Mr. Lee.
Thank you. If you wouldn't mind, could you just introduce yourself to the members of the jury, and if you could please spell your last name?
You bet. My name is Michael G. Haag, H-A-A-G.
And Mr. Haag, can you tell us what kind of work you do?
I'm involved in forensic work, specifically pertaining to firearms and physical evidence relating to firearms.
And do you own your own company?
I do.
And what's the name of your company, and if you could tell us a little bit about what your company does?
My company's name is Forensic Science Consultants. I've had it since around the year 2000, and it is a company that specializes in both training and casework involving shooting incident reconstruction. So the analysis of any physical evidence relating to firearms in order to determine what it is telling us.
And who are typical clients of yours?
The clients range widely. I do my work not based on who hires me, but rather the case itself and the physical evidence. So I've worked for prosecuting offices, law enforcement agencies, defense, criminal, civil. Any of those would be potential people who would hire me on to look at their work or look at their case.
You mentioned that your company does primarily work with shooting reconstruction. Does it do work in other forensic areas?
Primarily forensic shooting incident reconstruction, both training and casework for my company.
Can you tell us a little bit about your formal education, beginning with your undergraduate work?
Sure. I have an undergraduate or bachelor's of science degree in chemistry from the University of Arizona in Tucson with a math physics minor.
And how long have you been doing shooting reconstruction work?
For a very long time.
Both informally and formally.
My background is somewhat unique in that my father does what I do, so I grew up learning this business. So from the earliest ages I can remember, I would go out and assist him and begin learning what was going on with regard to physical evidence involving firearms. So I grew up in Arizona, and many weekends were spent out conducting testing either for research or for casework, and that's how I got started in the business. So the training goes back that far, but after I received my degree in chemistry, I went back and worked for his company, Forensic Science Services Incorporated, for about 2 years before I then moved on.
And in addition to the practical training that you received from your father, can you tell us a little bit about more formal training that you received in this area?
Absolutely. With regard to firearms and firearms evidence, that 2 years after college was certainly formal training, but additionally in about 1998 I went off to work with the Albuquerque Police Department in New Mexico, where I've been since then, so I've received training from them as well. I also, in that 2-year span, worked with the German Bundeskriminalamt, which is their version of the FBI, in both their trajectory and long-range calculation section, as well as their primer residue sections. And I've done cross-training with the San Diego Police Department and numerous classes and conferences since then.
So you not only maintain your own company, you also continue to be employed by the Albuquerque Police Department?
I do.
Okay. And we'll get back to that in just a moment. You mentioned living out in Arizona as a younger person. What is it about being outside, or what kind of practical training did you do when you went out with your father to do the quote-unquote testing?
That began the idea that, or influenced me greatly, in that both my father's as well as my opinion is that you train and you learn from hands-on testing. So in other words, you shoot things, and Arizona is a great place to do that. It's got lots of wide open spaces, and so whether, again, it's research or casework, you can go out and do those things. Observe actually what happens when bullets strike different materials, whether it be glass or steel, tissue simulant, wallboard, etc.
So you named a couple of things, but throughout your course of your career, what things have you shot at?
I'd actually have a hard time thinking of what I haven't shot over the years.
Have you shot at motor vehicles?
I have, many times.
Both in the framework as well as the glass?
I have.
Have you shot at material that simulates human organ and tissue and bone?
I have.
And what is that for the members of the jury? That whatever that substance is that simulates the inside of a human's body?
The common tissue simulant is ordnance gelatin, so it's what you would think. It's like a gelatin-type material, but constituted to a particular density and then kept at a particular temperature to simulate general tissue. And that's the standard in the field, especially in this country. But you can also shoot ordnance soap, which is commonly used in Europe.
So fair to say that the list of things, as you said, that you haven't shot at is a much smaller list than the list of things that you have shot at during your career?
At least off the top of my head, yes.
Okay. Now, Mr. Haag, do you hold any memberships in any professional organizations?
I do.
And can you tell the jury a little bit about that?
One of the primary organizations of which I'm a member is the Association of Firearm and Toolmark Examiners. I'm also a member of, I've forgotten if I'm currently a member of the IAI, the International Association for Identification, the Association for Crime Scene Reconstruction. I have been a member on and off of the California Association of Criminalists, the Southwest Association of Forensic Scientists, and I'm probably forgetting a few others.
Are you a member of what's known as the Organization of Scientific Area Committees for Forensic Science?
I am.
Commonly known as OSAC.
I am a member of the OSAC.
Can you tell the members of the jury what that is and what your responsibilities are with OSAC?
Sure. OSAC is an up-and-coming organization. It's been active for approximately 4 years now, and it's a federal government-sponsored organization headed by the Forensic Science Standards Board, which is meant to, by both practitioners, academics, and others, try to set down guidelines, procedures, protocols that we can all agree on in forensics, because there have been certainly different criticisms of forensics over the years from organizations such as the NAS saying that we need to advance and advance more quickly. Everyone's on board with that idea. And so the OSACs, the organization, the OSAC groups are below that forensic science standard boards, and they have different groups specializing in forensic disciplines. So for example, you would have an OSAC that specializes in biology, one that specializes in firearms and tool marks, one that specializes in latent fingerprints, blood spatter, and now crime scenes. So when the OSAC started, I was a member of the Firearm and Tool Mark Subcommittee for 2 years, and then most recently, the newest group is the crime scene group. And so I felt I could do more, especially with regard to shooting reconstruction there, and I was able to transfer over into the crime scene group, and we've been active for about a year. So again, the importance of this work is that we're trying to standardize and communicate amongst the practitioners across the country and better forensics as a whole. Provide these classes. We have cars, we have walls, we have all sorts of materials, concrete, asphalt, upon which to shoot, and the class gets to see it occur. That becomes a part of their basic knowledge, and their learning and their storehouse, their toolbox of information they can use in casework.
Now, you mentioned that you were also employed by the Albuquerque Police Department, and what is it that you do for the Albuquerque Police Department?
I've been with APD for approximately 20 years, of which the first 15 or so were as a bench forensic scientist. During that time period, I did everything from tool mark and firearm identification to crime scene work. And then for the past 5 years, I am now a supervisor. So I supervise firearms and tool marks as well as blood, breath alcohol, and controlled substances.
Mr. Haag, at some point, were you contacted to do some work by the Suffolk County District Attorney's Office in connection with the July 16, 2012 shooting deaths of 2 men in Boston?
I was.
And can you tell us specifically what you were asked to do in connection with that ongoing investigation?
I believe the first contact was made actually when I was teaching a class here in the Boston area back in, I believe it was 2015. And I was approached by some investigators in the course asking if I'd have interest in looking at the physical evidence and photographs to help them evaluate a potential number of shots fired in particular in a double homicide.
And at some point after that, did you receive some materials to review in connection with your work in this case?
I did.
And the materials that you received to review, was that materials that you asked for, or were they provided to you without your asking?
I have a list of documents that I request to observe that was sent out, and I received whatever back that was returned from that list.
Okay, so you have your own checklist of things that you consider to be important when you review a case?
I do.
And can you tell us what you reviewed in connection, what materials and or evidence you reviewed in connection with your evaluation in this case?
Absolutely. May I refer to my notes to refresh my memory?
You may.
Thank you. I can, of course, go into listing this, but in general, I observed and looked at autopsy reports, photographs for both individuals, Boston Police Department crime scene photographs, statements, some search warrant documentation, photographs for both a 4Runner and a BMW, photograph log, other reports generated by law enforcement agencies, grand jury minutes, homicide reports, and then on to physical evidence, such as clothing from both of the decedents as well as projectile items that were recovered.
Now, let me just back up to a couple of the things that you looked at. You mentioned you looked at some photographs. Among those photographs, were there included photographs of the car that was the purported vehicle in which the victims were sitting when they were shot?
There were.
Okay, and were there multiple photographs of that vehicle that were sent to you?
There were.
You mentioned Boston Police Department reports. How many of those reports in total do you recall having reviewed?
I have at least 26 listed, 37 total, Form 26 reports, but I don't have them listed out as far as actual individual ones in my report, so I don't have a specific number for you.
Yeah, that's okay. And how many sets of grand jury minutes did you review in connection with this case?
It looks like 22 total.
And how many homicide interview reports?
Those 31 total, as I have listed.
Now, Mr. Haag, you mentioned that you received some items and evidence, and am I to understand that you actually received the specific items of evidence, not simply photographs of them?
That's correct.
So you received certain projectiles in connection with this case?
I did.
Some articles of clothing?
I did.
And after reviewing all the materials that you just described, both the documentary materials as well as the physical evidence, and after applying your experience and expertise, did you form an opinion to a reasonable degree of certainty associated with shooting reconstruction and trajectory analysis as to the number of shots that were fired in this case?
I did.
And what is your opinion with respect to the number of shots that were fired in this case?
I see physical evidence that indicates a minimum of 5 shots fired in this case.
And when you say a minimum number of shots fired being 5, what do you specifically mean by that?
I mean that an actual evaluation of the physical evidence that I both observed in photographs as well as tangibly, that's what I have enough traces of to make that conclusion. Could there be more that left no physical trace? I can never rule that out. And in fact, that's pretty much true of almost every shooting that we work.
And using the the physical evidence in this case, what would be an example of, for instance, of a shot fired that would leave no ballistic evidence, so therefore make it impossible for you to determine whether that extra shot was fired?
Potentially a shot that was fired off into the distance that didn't actually impact anything, say, on the vehicle, for example, directly behind the vehicle. It's actually very difficult to spot projectile impacts in asphalt. So if you ricochet a projectile into asphalt, it may be very difficult to identify that or even find fragments of that.
So 5 is the number of shots for which you could trace physical evidence of.
As far as what I can see that yes, shows a path of individual projectiles, that would be the minimum.
Now, now in the list of things that you identified, Mr. Haag, as having examined in this case, one thing you did not mention was the vehicle that the victims were alleged to have been sitting in. And were you able to examine the actual vehicle in this case?
I was not.
Okay. And how many of your investigations, that is, requests to do shooting reconstruction analysis, involve shootings where vehicles are part of the scene?
Of course, I don't have an exact statistical value for you. I don't track that number. But from memory, I would estimate anywhere from 30 to 50% of my shooting incidents involve vehicles in one way or another.
And of that number, how often or how frequently do you have access to the actual vehicle in your assessment of the evidence?
Whether the vehicle is actually kept or not, or retained until someone in my position as a private consultant comes in later, seems to be about 50-50, I would estimate, whether the vehicle is actually still retained or not. Obviously, if it's not retained, there's nothing I can look at first person.
And based on your experience as a supervisor of the physical ID unit at the Albuquerque Police Department, are you aware of some challenges in preserving certain kinds of physical evidence, such as a motor vehicle, for the entire lifetime of an investigation?
As a part of a law enforcement agency working for a municipality and as a citizen, yes, I understand that as a forensic scientist, I would like to see everything kept forever, but I understand that logistics and costs come into play as far as who decides what to keep or not, and that's outside of my purview. But my experience is it's about 50-50 with something like this.
How would having the vehicle, how would having had the vehicle in this case available to you affected your opinion, if at all, if you had been able to look at it physically up in person?
It's always better to look at it in person, of course, and see the actual items. So I would have preferred it. As far as the minimum number of shots fired, I'm comfortable with the conclusions I've made based on the physical evidence and photographs available.
So, Mr. Haag, I'd like to take you through, or have you take us through, the analysis that you did with respect to the shots that you documented as part of your conclusions. I'd like to start with what I'll simply call on my own a shot number 1, and that's the alleged gunshot wound to the right temple of Mr. Safiro Furtado. Now, you examined autopsy reports in connection with this case?
And photographs. I did.
Photographs. Based on your examination and review of the autopsy and the photographs associated with the autopsy, did you or were you able to form an opinion regarding the path that this bullet took, the one that struck Mr. Furtado in the right temple?
I was.
And what is your opinion as to the path that bullet took?
This is one of the simpler trajectories involved in the case because, of course, the bullet stays in one place more or less. And one of the first things that I looked at was the shape of the hole. And this is a big portion of what I generally teach is the shapes of these holes when bullets strike things can be very indicative of whether they are, number one, stable or unstable and deformed. So if a bullet leaves the muzzle of a gun and is properly spin stabilized by the rifling within the barrel, it's like a football going down range. And when that bullet then strikes something, if it strikes orthographically, basically 90 degrees to a plane, it generally leaves a nice round hole depending on what it strikes. Things like wallboard, wood, tissue, skin, clothing, we see this phenomenon or this shape commonly for those kinds of impacts. If we shallow it out, if the bullet is nice and stable, we generally see elliptical shapes or at least parabolas like that at the lead-in portion where the bullet strikes things, potentially seeing bullet wipe transfer. And if we see those shapes, if I can observe those characteristics at the impact site, it's telling me it's a really good bet that that is the first impact site after the gun, the primary impact. If we have something different, what in the pathology field they would call irregular, and we use that word too as far as terminal ballistics and shooting reconstruction goes. If the hole is irregular, it's indicating to us that the bullet has hit something else first and is now unstable or tumbling when it strikes, or is potentially deformed as well. So that means I should be looking further uprange. With this first shot, which we're discussing, which bear in mind I have no opinions as far as chronology of shots in this case, but the one we're talking about, we have a start point and an end point for the projectile in one person. On the right temple, I observe a very nice round hole, indicating that the bullet hit nothing else before it got there, and the bullet stayed in the individual's head. So generally, entrance is on the right side of the head, and generally the bullet was recovered over on the left-hand side, and I examined that projectile.
Was this item, this particular bullet, one of the items that was sent to you and one of the items that you examined as part of your work in this case?
It is.
And was that item, as it was sent to you, already given a item number for cataloging purposes in connection with the case?
It was.
And is that item number 15?
That sounds correct.
Your Honor, I believe these photographs are coming in without objection. Ms. Kenny Bodden and I have discussed it previously.
So to speak things in one, I believe before we even...
Is that already in evidence?
No,
Or are you
no.
going to have that identified?
Yes.
Very good.
May I approach, Your Honor?
You may.
Now, just before we get to that picture, in addition to looking at the physical evidence that was sent to you, Mr. Haag, did you also photograph independently the pieces of evidence or certain pieces of evidence?
I photographed every piece of physical evidence that I looked at.
Okay. And what you have in front of you there, can you tell us what that is?
These are my photographs, and they're labeled as of item 15.
Okay, and that's the projectile that you were just talking to the jury about, is that correct?
It is.
Your Honor, right off of that is the next numbered exhibit.
No
Actually,
objection.
No objections.
Thank you.
it's actually two photographs, correct?
Correct.
Is that two photographs on one sheet?
Yes.
All right, we'll mark that as a single exhibit.
Is it 340?
Showing you Exhibit 340 that's just been introduced. Mr. Haag, the appearance of that projectile, those are two pictures of the same item, is that correct?
Yes.
Okay, and just for the clarification, they both appear to be sitting on what looks to be gridded paper. And can you tell us what that is?
That's paper that I print out that has approximate quarter-inch grids underneath it to give viewers an idea of scale.
And this projectile that you examined, based upon your experience, did it have similar characteristics that are consistent with the path the bullet took as part of the opinion that you formed in this case?
It does.
And can you explain to the members of the jury what telltale characteristics there are that are consistent with where that bullet is alleged to have traveled?
One of the areas in shooting reconstruction that we look at or use is the type of damage and deformation to a projectile to see where it's been. Every time a bullet, well, not every time, but when projectiles generally hit things at common muzzle velocities, they will take up damage that reflects what they've hit. So with this projectile, that very textured damage to the gray lead core is very common and indicative of bone damage. This type of bullet has a big portion of lead on the nose that's exposed. There's no jacketing material over it. On this bullet, the base of it is enclosed by a jacket. The jacketing material on the sides, right at the junction between lead and copper, are peeled backwards, which is indicative of soft damage, is a good term for it, meaning things like tissue, such as brain, muscle, etc. And that's a common way that bullets will mushroom, is another word that some people would use to describe that. But other than that, the bullet is slightly squished, if you will, as far as the cylindrical portion of it. But those characteristics that I mentioned corroborate and are great indicators of what we know it did entered the right side of the temple, went into soft tissue, and then stopped.
And the arrow I've drawn, is that directed at the area where you discussed the peeling back of the jacketing?
It is, and the other picture on the left also has nice representations of that, where what was once facing forward has peeled back down and around the sides.
And do those arrows indicate that?
They do, as well as I would arrow the one to the left as well, yes.
This particular projectile that you examined, did you end up weighing it?
I did.
And what did you notice about that projectile when you weighed it?
I believe it was missing some of its mass, which is not unexpected.
If I could take you now to what I will call the second shot, and this is the shot, alleged gunshot injuries to Mr. Furtado's upper right arm and upper back. Did you do an examination, or did you review the autopsy report with respect to this particular injury on Mr. Furtado?
I did, as well as the clothing.
All right. And based upon your examination of the clothing, the autopsy report, and the photographs from the autopsy report, did you form an opinion regarding the path of this bullet?
I did.
And could you tell us what your opinion is?
The path of this projectile is generally from right to left, exiting the right rear back area and entering the area I'm referring to or pointing to now.
Based on your examination and review of photographs, clothing, scene photographs, and reports, did you form an opinion regarding whether the bullet that struck Mr. Furtado in the arm and upper back, what it did after exiting Mr. Furtado's back?
I did, although this one kind of goes to the projectile and then comes back to the back in a way.
Okay, and can you just explain what you mean by that?
Sure. As far as where this projectile went, one of the things that I'm trying to do is to figure out which bullets go with which trajectories and gunshot wounds, of course. And while examining some of the projectiles, I noticed one in particular that had some particularly interesting damage on it that then logically goes back to this gunshot wound.
So let's get to that in just a second. I want to... Approach the witness, Your Honor.
You may.
You recognize those photographs?
I do.
Okay. And those photographs, were those part of the photographs that you reviewed in connection with this case?
They were.
They were among the photographs that were sent to you, that is.
Correct.
And how many, again, that's one sheet with multiple photographs on it.
It is.
And what are we generally looking at in those pictures?
In these photographs, we're looking at the front right seat of the BMW vehicle, particularly the headrest. Two of them reflect the front and the back. One is a close-up of the exit out the back side, and one of them is a close-up of the entrance in the front side, which is E, the exit is D.
Your Honor, at this time, I'd offer that as the next exhibit.
No objection.
We've received 341.
Sure.
Thank you.
Okay, asking you to take a look at the photograph in the top right corner. Do you see the pink stick that's protruding from the passenger side headrest?
I do.
And what is that called?
Commonly referred to as a trajectory rod. They're commonly steel or aluminum, and they're used to visualize the paths bullets took when they went through things.
And the back of that rod, is it fair to say, is protruding from the rear of that headrest in the photograph that's on the left?
It is.
Now, did you label the holes in the headrest with letter or not did you? Or did you receive photographs of the holes into which the trajectory rod was going and out of which the trajectory rod was coming? Did you receive photographs that were purportedly labeled D and E?
I did.
All right. And with respect to E, what is that showing?
That particular hole, it's a little dark as you view it here, but it would be the entrance, and it's not particularly regular at all. It's not nice and round. It's not parabolic. There's not what we call bullet wipe around this hole. So it's indicating to me that the bullet hit something else prior to hitting E at the headrest. Also, from looking at other pictures from the decedents, or of the decedents in the vehicle, the exit wound in the back right shoulder area is in this general area. So it's a good candidate for the reason why that bullet would be unstable going into E.
Is if it had passed through the arm and upper back of Mr. Furtado.
That's correct.
And tell us what you noticed, if anything, about hole D. That is the exit hole marked by the letter D, as well as the trajectory rod photograph on the left top.
Yes. Also, a hole in the right front headrest, but this is where the bullet exited from that headrest.
And what's the nature of the hole out of the exit in hole D?
Also irregular, as would be expected for an exit.
Now, you mentioned that you looked at some other items in connection with your conclusion with respect to this shot, and could you remind us again what you looked at in connection with this shot?
A projectile item in particular recovered from Mr. Ferreri's arm.
Showing you those 2 pages, Mr. Haag, do you recognize what's shown on those? Well, let's start with the top one. What's shown in that top one?
3 photographs of the sides of the projectile that I took, 2 of the flattened front face of the lead-exposed core of that projectile.
And that was previously assigned in item number 27 before you looked at it?
That's my recollection
All right.
as well.
And those photographs that are on that first sheet, are all those photographs that you personally took?
Yes.
All right. And referring you to the second sheet, what's shown on the second sheet?
2 images at the top of the lead flattened area of this projectile.
And are there anything else shown on the second sheet?
The middle image is another one I think that we've already talked about, of a trajectory rod going into the right front headrest. And the 3 at the bottom are of an exemplar headrest that I purchased.
And the 3 photographs at the bottom, are those photographs that you took of the exemplar?
They are.
Your Honor, at this time I'd offer those 2 sheets of the next 2 exhibits.
No objection, any.
342, 343.
Showing you exhibit number 342. Now this is all the same bullet, correct?
Correct.
Okay. And this is the bullet that was purportedly removed from Mr. Freery's right forearm. Is that correct? Or at least that was represented to you in the materials that you received.
That's correct.
and you mentioned that you saw some interesting things about this particular shape and size of the bullet. Could you talk to or tell us and tell the jurors what it is that you saw that struck your eye?
Well, what struck me about this projectile is that nice angled, flat portion of the nose that has stria, or scratches on it, that are off axis. It also has some of the peeling back effect of that jacket going backwards, back around the sides of the, appears to be copper, but it's actually steel jacket material.
I'm going to hand you this pen. You could use the rubber tip. The monitor you have in front of you is a telestrator, so you can actually draw on it. You mentioned that you stria. Could you show the members of the jury where the stria are shown?
Referring to this image in the lower left corner, stria run right here, and I'm drawing over most of them. But the axis of the projectile from the base towards the nose is about like that. So lead is a very soft material. You can scratch it with your thumb, you can bend it, and when it impacts things, it tends to take up the texture and shape of that object. So what this damage is telling me is that it struck something relatively hard. It's slightly curved, so whatever it was certainly gave, but that when it struck whatever that material is, it was already tumbling. It was already in yaw. If it had struck directly onto a material, such as a relatively smooth material, then I'm going to use the right picture at the lower portion here. Those stria should be going right down the nose, but also at least along the central axis of the projectile. And actually, this is a demonstration I do at pretty much every class I teach. Whereas what we have are off-axis stria, like that. So it's giving me not only some information about what it struck, but what type of material it struck.
And the stria that are not parallel or off kilter from the axis tells you that it then tumbled as a result of hitting that item?
It's telling me that it was actually tumbling before it struck that item. It certainly would continue to tumble after it went through this material, but that it was unstable when it got there.
And a projectile having traveled through Mr. Furtado's upper back, would that be consistent with your opinion that it had struck something prior to hitting the headrest?
That's correct.
Now, you mentioned exemplar headrest, and showing you now what's been admitted as exhibit number 343. And at the top of that are just repeat photographs of what we were just looking at. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Or two of the photographs that we're looking at. And the middle photograph is is what we had looked at before with the trajectory rod. Is that true?
Correct.
Now, these three photographs below you, what did you do? What did you mean by exemplar headrest?
A sample, a similar item. So I actually ordered a headrest from a BMW that year in my model.
And explain to us what the three photographs at the bottom are.
They're sectioned or sequenced shots of me sectioning that headrest to see what's in it. So having observed that damage to the projectile, that piqued my interest as far as what could have been in this headrest. And until you buy one and cut it open, you don't know.
Now, did you attempt at any point to line up the entry point into the leather with the plastic underneath it?
I did, visually based on the photographs with the trajectory rod in place and without from when the examination of the vehicle took place.
And did you draw any opinion about whether a bullet passing through at the trajectory that the rod indicates would have struck plastic in this particular headrest?
Yes, I believe it would have struck this plastic, and it's a very thick, as I recall, 1/4 inch to 3/8 hard plastic. It's not some thin membrane.
And the kind of damage that you saw on the bullets, is that consistent with the kind of damage you would see from the type of material that you found inside the headrest?
Based on my past experience with shooting things, collecting the bullets, and looking at the damage that's created by those types of impacts, yes.
Now, Did you actually shoot at the headrest that you purchased or obtained from BMW?
Not this particular headrest, no.
Okay, and was there a particular reason why you didn't fire any shots at the headrest?
No, not in particular. I'm very comfortable seeing this kind of damage and having shot similar materials in the past with that conclusion.
So now just reviewing the second shot, you've accounted for 2 wounds on the back of Mr. Furtado, 2 holes in the headrest, and that's the bullet that was reported to you as having been recovered from Mr. Frere's right forearm. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay.
The right side entry wounds for both of the shots actually are basically round or elliptical holes, meaning that they're telling us the bullets are stable. They didn't strike something else first. The holes on the left side are irregular, meaning they exited on that side, so generally right to left.
And did you also have an opportunity to look at the clothing that was alleged to have been worn by Mr. De Abreu for similar purposes of establishing whether the holes were irregular or not?
I did.
And I'm sorry, what did you observe?
The same concept of regular versus irregular on tissue applies to clothing, and same conclusion.
You recognize what I've just shown you, Mr. Haag?
I do.
And that is, in common terms, just what's called the wound chart in connection with Mr. De Abreu. Is that correct?
That's correct.
All right. And that is what you reviewed in connection with your, among the things that you reviewed in connection with your opinions that you're giving today. Is that fair to say?
That's fair.
Your Honor, at this time, I'd offer that as the next exhibit.
And we've received 344.
Showing you exhibit number 344, and specifically referring you to what you just described as wound B and wound C. And in this diagram, your understanding is that wound B is the entrance or the exit?
B would be an entrance.
And C would be the exit?
Correct.
Now, after reviewing the autopsy report and photographs, did you then attempt to determine what the projectile that exited at C would have done or did do inside the vehicle?
I did with both of these trajectories sort of simultaneously.
Okay, so let's talk about the 2 trajectories, and then we'll go back to that. Did you observe a second wound based upon your review of the autopsy report and photographs?
I did.
And what wound did you, this would have been wound A/D?
Correct.
Okay, and can you tell us whether you formed an opinion about the path of the bullet that caused wounds A/D?
Again, similarly, based on the characteristics of the hole, the right side hole in both the clothing and skin is indicative of entrance. The left would be exit. So generally a wound path of right to left for this one as well.
And in this particular wound chart, is the letter A the entrance or the exit?
That would be the entrance.
Okay. And D would be the exit?
Correct.
Now, did you, based upon, after you determined or formed an opinion about the path of these 2 bullets, did you then attempt to try to figure out where those 2 bullets may have gone once they passed through Mr. De Abreu's body?
I did.
And can you tell the members of the jury what opinions you formed?
Well, based on the crime scene photographs, seeing where this individual was in the deceased position being the driver's seat, you have to logically think what's downrange from those trajectories, what's the next thing in the path of the projectile. So for a driver, of course, you have the door. In the photographs, I can see that the window is down, but there is one impact site on the inside of the door that was labeled A. that's in a sort of plasticky wood laminate type of material just to the left of this decedent. So we have two projectiles. We have one impact site in the door, A, door and the open window. Door and the open window are the best candidates for where these bullets could have gone. Door and the open window are the best candidates for where these bullets could have gone. We have one impact site in the door, A, and we don't have another impact site in this general area. For this reason, it's a logical conclusion that the lower of the two parallel paths goes into the door, but quite frankly, the other one could have gone out that window and be lost to the scene.
Let's talk about the bullet that you concluded struck the door at position A. Did you observe any ballistics itself, whether it be jacketing, core, or anything else inside of that impact A?
I did not see anything in the pictures, and nothing was documented as coming from it.
Did you, at some point during the course of your examination of the evidence in this case, find something in the vehicle, or did you just look at a piece of ballistics that could have been a candidate for having struck impact site A based upon the characteristics of the projectile?
We do.
And what was that one?
There was a projectile that's nearly intact that was recovered from the left rear floorboard, as I recall.
Showing you those 3 sheets of paper and asking you to take a look at the top one. Do you recognize what's shown on the top?
I do.
And what's shown on the top?
These are photographs that I reviewed of the projectile on the left rear floorboard.
And that was identified prior to your getting this as item number 5, is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay. And there are 3 different photographs, but of the same item. Is that fair to say?
That's correct.
Referring you to the second sheet, what's shown in the second sheet?
These are my photographs of that same item, item 5.
And those are the ones that you specifically took yourself once the projectile was sent out to you?
Correct.
And lastly, the third sheet, what's shown on that?
This is the very superficial spot of damage that's labeled as A on the vehicle on the inside of the left door.
Your Honor, at this time, I'd offer those 3 as the next numbered exhibits.
No objection against any of this.
Why don't we proceed them in the order in which they've been identified?
Showing you exhibit number 345. The bottom image is, it doesn't appear to be visible in the other 2, but the bottom image is the projectile that was identified for you as item number 5. In other words, you didn't make it item number 5. It was already numbered when you got it. Correct?
That's correct.
Okay. And you photographed it. And that's the photograph that you took of that particular projectile, correct?
Some of the photographs I took,
Some of the
yes.
photographs. Showing you exhibit number 347. This is the damage to the inside driver's door that you described for us.
It is.
And that material at impact site A, what is that material generally?
In my classes, when we shoot cars, we dig through them and find the bullets regularly. So I've kind of got a feeling for what some of these materials commonly are. And as I stated before, this strip that sort of has a wood grain texture appears to either be actual wood laminate or a plasticky type material.
Referring you back now to 346, when you examined that bullet, did you see any characteristics that led to your opinion about where that bullet had gone
I did.
and what it had hit?
Yeah. Once again, we're looking at the lead core in particular on this bullet. Remember that the core is the interior portion covered by a sheath, in this case of steel with a copper wash on top of it. And that very rough texture, again, compared to what we were looking at in the bullet from the very shallow penetration of Mr. Friere's arm, which was smooth, this is more indicative of hitting more textured material like bone. So as it traversed the torso, it picked up that damage. This is a good classic type of damage for those interactions with bone.
Consistent with having traveled through ribs, for instance.
Correct.
And could you just use your pen to show us what you were talking about when you were describing the characteristics on the bullet?
We can see inside where I'm drawing with the pen, inside the gray, that very rough textured damage. And we can even see somewhat of the jacket beginning to peel back from that soft damage that I also described. Bear in mind that all bullets don't behave exactly the same, so especially with soft point bullets, meaning there's no cavity in the nose, they just have a flat portion of lead to them. They're known as not being consistent expanders necessarily, so we're only seeing the beginnings of that softer damage right there that I've actually drawn over partially.
And that's a bullet that you associated with the lower wound on Mr. De Abreu, is that correct?
That's a good logical conclusion, just based on the height and if he was in generally the same position when the two shots were fired.
And as far as the bullet that caused the injuries at B and C, did you see any damage inside the car that would be indicative of having been caused by a bullet on the trajectory of the wounds B and C?
I did not.
And you indicated earlier that a reason for that could have been it could have just simply gone out of an open window?
Entirely possible. That area just to the left of the decedent, you have two options, pretty much door or open window.
So just to recap, that's 4 shots now, correct? That's the shot that was in Mr. Furtado's temple. There was the shot that went through the upper back and right arm of Mr. Furtado that in your opinion ended up in Mr. Friere's right arm. That's 2. And then the 2 parallel track wounds in the chest cavity of Mr. De Abreu for a total of 4. Is that correct?
Correct.
Okay. So let's talk about the last one. Did you at some point examine a second gunshot wound to the head area of Mr. Furtado?
I did review pictures of it, absolutely.
And the autopsy report in connection with Mr. Furtado's autopsy?
Correct.
And based upon your examination of the autopsy report as well as the photographs that came along with it, did you form an opinion as to the path that this bullet took with respect to Mr. Furtado?
I did.
And can you tell us what opinion you formed?
For similar reasons and characteristics described before, the wound to the right rear portion of the head has regular characteristics. The exit, irregular characteristics, so generally, again, right to left, slightly front to back anatomically.
And based upon your examination of the entrance site of that wound, were you able to draw any conclusions about whether that bullet was likely to have struck anything before striking Mr. De Abreu?
Because the entrance is nice and regular.
Mr. Furtado, I apologize.
because the entrance wound is nice and regular, it has the good characteristics of a primary impact, so nothing else before it arrived at his head.
And you mentioned that there was an irregular exit wound to Mr. Furtado's head. Did you form an opinion about the location where that bullet went as a result of exiting Mr. Furtado's head?
Just based on the body itself, and because people have a significant amount of mobility to them, of course, visually or spatially, there are several places it could have gone, but we have another impact to discuss.
Okay. And that impact site was what impact site?
As I recall, this is, and I'll refer to my notes if that's okay. Thanks, sir. Just to make sure I get the letters correct. In the front left driver's headrest at G and H were the labels that I observed in the photographs.
In addition to looking at holes G and H inside the driver's headrest, did you follow, or were you able to follow generally the trajectory rod into a further termination point?
There are photographs of a trajectory rod through this set of impacts that then leads to what's commonly called the B-pillar, right behind the driver's seat, in between the front and back area.
Okay, and that's the part of the car that basically separates the front door from the back door, that area in between, what you're calling the pillar.
Correct, and there are stickers labeled C and B for that set of impacts.
Showing you those three sheets, Mr. Haag, do you well, let's talk about the first one. What's shown in that first picture?
These appear to be pictures of the vehicle. The first one showing GH in the front left headrest. The second one over, same, almost the exact same perspective, but with a trajectory rod in it. And the third one, a close-up shot.
And those are three photographs, or among three of the photographs that you reviewed with respect to the driver's side area of the car?
They are.
All right, and the second sheet, can you describe for us what's on that?
Upper left corner is a view from the right side of the vehicle showing the previously described perforation of the front right headrest, but also seeing the front left headrest with a rod in it. Upper right picture is actually a duplicate, I think. A duplicate from the previous page showing the driver's headrest. Then there are two pictures showing the trajectory rod through the driver's headrest going directly to the impact sites that I described in the B pillar at B and C.
And what about the third sheet? What's shown on the third sheet?
The third sheet shows impacts B and C, which include C through some sort of trim material, an irregular hole, as well as then B in the metal behind it. And the one on the right is rotated, so you'd have to rotate this to get the orientation correctly, but a mid-distance view of the same.
Your Honor, at this time I'd offer those three sheets as the next three numbered exhibits.
No objection?
They'll be received. Mr. Lee, before we go through those.
Yes.
Mr. Lee, I'm going to pause here. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm told your lunch has arrived. So why don't we get a bite to eat and receive